One of the most fundamental parts of CSS is the box model. So in order to progress in this section, we now need to learn what the box model is all about. So, what is the box model? Well, the box model defines how elements are displayed on a web page and how they are sized. So in this box model, each and every element on a page can be seen as a rectangular box. Now, each of these boxes can of course have some content. For example, text, an image, a table, or something else. Then, around the box, we can define a border using a special CSS property. So a border goes around the entire element and is still part of the element. Now, the next aspect of the box model is padding. So padding is basically empty space that we can create around the element's content. So between the content and the border. And you can see that nicely here in this diagram. Now, just like the border, the padding is also still inside of the element. So essentially, padding is empty space that we can create inside elements. And with this, we actually finish the visible part of the element. So the part of the element that is contained inside of the box. Now, by default, the dimensions of the box are automatically defined by its content. However, we can also manually set the box dimensions using the width and height properties. This width and height will include the padding and the border as long as we set the box sizing property to border box. But anyway, now moving outside the actual visible element, we have margin. And margin is similar to padding, because it also creates empty space, but this empty space is around the element, so it's located outside of the element itself. In practice, we use margin to create space between elements. So if, for example, we want space between two certain elements on our page, we simply specify the margin property on one of them. Now, just note that all these properties are optional, of course, so we haven't been using them and our page has still been working fine. So we don't have to specify paddings or a border or margins or even some width or some height. So we can define none of them or some of them or even all of them. It really depends on how we want our layout to look like. Okay, and now that we have a good idea of the box model and how all these properties work, let's go back to code. Now, if we look at our page here, we see that actually there's already a lot of predefined space. So all of the space here that we see around this heading, for example, is coming from somewhere. So we can see that nicely in the developer tools here. So when we hover over this H1, or we can also just right-click directly on this element and inspect. And so then we get it also highlighted here. So you see that up there, the blue part is basically for the content and the orange parts are for the margin. And in fact, if we come down here and take a look again at these user agent style sheets, then we see that there are some margin properties which have these values here. And the same is true for this paragraph here. So you see, again, the orange space is basically the margin of the element. So in order to style our page, it is best to actually reset all of these margins and paddings. So basically get rid of everything that the browser adds by default. And so that's where our global selector here comes into play again. So basically what we want to do is to remove padding and margin on every single element. Now with the text, we did that here on the body. Remember the text color and the font family, because these properties did get inherited to the child elements. But margin and paddings do not. So we need to set them explicitly on every single element. And so that's when we use the global selector. So selecting every single element and set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0 as well. Okay, so all the space has disappeared. And now we can easily add our own space in order to create our own design. All right, let's just get rid of this text align here, because this was just to show you it's not actually part of our final design. What we also need to do before we can start, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, is to add the box sizing property. So in order for the box model to work in the way that I just showed you before, we need to set box sizing to border box on every single element of the page, because only then the height and width properties work as expected. And so this is a default, basically all of this here. This is kind of a default that we do on every single page that we write. So like a global reset. Some people do some more things, but I like to keep it simple and do it like this. So I have this here on every single page that you will see from me. But anyway, let's now start adding back some space here to make our page look designed. So first, let's take a look at our big parts of the page, which are this header here, the form, and this main part here, remember. So we have the header, the form, and main, right? So actually, just like with the form, I like to give the header here also a class, so that then in the CSS, we select everything using a class. So let's just call it header as well. So now the header has a distinct name and fact form as well. So let's select that here with, again, the class selector and then the name of the class. And now we can add to start some margin here. So we can write margin, let's say 40 pixels. And you see immediately it added 40 pixels, or at least some space here, around the entire element. So we can select that here. And then there in orange, you see that space. And if we turn it on and off here, then you see how it changes. So that's what we use this inspector here and these dev tools for. All right. So remember how I mentioned before that we use margin basically to create space between elements. And so in this case, I want the margin simply to create some vertical space between this header and the form, and then also between the form and the main part. And so we can set these margins on only specific sides. So I can say, for example, margin dash left. Now you can see it. But so here you see that the space has only been added to the left side. So the orange bar is there now only on the left. Or we could say also margin top and then 300 pixels. And then it moved down 300 pixels. So we created some space with that. Okay, but in fact, what we are interested in here is this vertical space. And so what we usually do to create vertical space is to simply add some space to the bottom of the element. So that will look like this. All right, so we have 40 pixels now at the bottom of the header. And so let's do the same for the fact form. So that will then create some space here as well. So margin bottom, let's again go with 40 pixels. And so that looks a little bit nicer. And it starts looking more similar to what we have here. So here we have those 40 pixels and here those other 40 pixels. Okay, so next up, let's add some spacing here to these facts here. Let's close that and come here. All right. But before we do that, we actually need to change something in our HTML, I think at least. So you see that here we added the class of fact only to the paragraphs, right? And so that's why these buttons here, they are outside of this box with the color. So with the background color of this gray, right? But in fact, what we want the fact to be is this entire list item here, so that it also includes basically these buttons here. So this box with the buttons. And so what we need to do now is to grab this and cut it and actually put it here on the list. So if we give this a save, you see that this first one here has already been changed, and so the buttons are now inside. And again, we can see that nicely by right-clicking. And so, yeah, so the fact here now is this entire element. And you see it became blue, so it has now that paragraph and also this div here inside of it. So again, I want you to get into this habit of using this inspector like this all the time, as it's really helpful to really grasp what is going on. Let's now do the same here. Give it a save, and there we go. So now what we need to do is to add some margin, because, well, right now it doesn't even look like two facts, but only as one fact, because there's just no space between them. And so again, what we can do to add that vertical space is to add a margin to the bottom. So remember the class is fact, and so let's come here and add our margin bottom. And here let's go for a smaller value, let's say 16 pixel. And so that's already a lot nicer. But we can do still better. So we used margin to create space outside of elements. But now remember that we can also use padding to create space inside of elements. So here, this text is really like smashed to the sides of this box. So that's not really what we want. And so we use padding now to add space inside of the box. So let's also try 16 pixels here. And there you go. So now you have some space inside. So padding is really useful when we have some background color or, for example, some border. And since we're talking of border, let me just quickly show you how we would create a border. So to create a border, we just write the border property. And now for the first time, we have a property that accepts multiple values. So we need to specify 3 different things for a border. First, the width, for example, 4 pixels. Then basically the style, which can be solid, or it can be dotted, or dashed, or things like that. And then finally the color. So let's say simply red here, and give it a save, and there it is. So there is the border, and it could be also, for example, dashed, and so on and so forth. So for now, that's not really what we want. I just wanted to show you how we can specify a border. But we were talking about padding, right? And just like with margin, we can actually specify it on different sides. So we can also write padding left, for example, let's say 40 pixels, and watch what happens now. Well, nothing happened. That's because I was missing the T here. So padding left, of course, does not exist. Padding left does. And so you see that now there is a bigger space on this side. So the space on the other sides is still there because first we set it to 16, basically overall, and then we overrode the left side with this line that comes next. And by the way, if it was the other way around, if this was after, then this line of code would override this one. So here we set the left side first, but then after that we set all 4 sides to 16. And so then this one here would be lost, basically. But that's not what we want. Anyway, we want 16 everywhere. Or actually, let me show you even something else. So I hope that it's not being too much here. But yeah, just follow along here. So what I want to do now, which is something quite typical actually, is to add the same space on the top and the bottom, and on the left, on the right, some other space, so some bigger space. So basically I want to set the padding on the top to 16. I want the padding on the bottom to be 16. So yeah, that is working. And then I want the left side, let's say 30 for now, and also the right side. Okay, so different values vertically and horizontally. So vertically 16, horizontally on the left and right 30. And since this is very common, there is something called a shorthand for setting padding like this. So instead of writing these 4 lines, we can simply use padding again, and then we can set 2 values. So we can set the first one to a 16, which will be the vertical, and then the second one to 30, which will be horizontal. So if we delete all this, then you see that it is still working the same. And if we added 300 here, well, that's a bit too much maybe. So you see that it affected the left and the right sides. Okay, so we do this all the time. So this was very important for me to show you. The actual value that I want to use is simply 24, just to give it a bit more space and make it look nicer in the design. Okay, but let's move on from this part now and go here to this form. So here we also have some background color, but it doesn't look really nice. So usually we always need some padding there. So let's go to the form and add some padding there as well. And let's again do different vertical and horizontal spacing. So 16 as well for top bottom, and let's say even 40 pixels on the sides, so left and right. Okay, so this is starting to look a little bit nicer. And just to finish now, let's fix something else, which is basically that all of these boxes here are now glued to the sides, and including, of course, all this content over here. And again, that is happening because we did this global reset. So we want to add some of that space back, and we want it inside of the page. So the page, remember, is basically the entire body. And so we want space inside of that. And so we can use padding on the body. So let's say 48 pixels for now, or just 40, just like the rest. We will fix this a little bit later. And great. So that's looking better. And it's looking definitely closer to what we have here. Right? Here we have everything already laid out, and here not. But trust me, we are getting there. But before we do that, we need to quickly talk about something called inline and block elements right in the next lecture.